London, England, July 1943. The evening air hung thick with the smell of coal smoke and fish and chips as American servicemen crowded into a pub near Piccadilly Circus, their voices loud with the confidence of men who believed they were bringing civilization to a war-weary city. They had no idea that within the next hour, their assumptions about power, privilege, and the natural order of things would be challenged in a way that would make international headlines and force the United States Army to confront uncomfortable truths about the soldiers it had sent to save Europe. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these white American soldiers were about to learn was that the prejudices they had carried across the Atlantic Ocean did not carry the same weight on British soil, and that sometimes the most powerful resistance comes not from enemy armies, but from ordinary people who simply refuse to accept injustice when they see it. Private First Class Lloyd Thompson had been in London for exactly 11 days when he walked into the Red Lion pub on a warm summer evening in 1943. At 22 years old, Thompson was one of approximately 130,000 black American servicemen who would eventually serve in the European theater during the conflict, most of them assigned to quartermaster, transportation and engineering units rather than combat roles. The United States Army of that era operated under strict segregation policies, with black soldiers serving in separate units, eating in separate mess halls, and living in separate barracks from their white counterparts. This system of separation was not merely informal custom, but official military policy, enforced with the same rigor as any other regulation in the Army Field Manual. Thompson had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, where the rules about where black people could sit, eat, or even walk were as familiar to him as breathing. His father had been a porter at the train station, a job that required him to be unfailingly polite to white passengers, regardless of how they treated him. His mother worked as a domestic servant for a white family on the other side of town, leaving before dawn and returning after dark 6 days a week. Thompson had 2 younger sisters who were still in school and an older brother who had moved north to Chicago in 1938, seeking opportunities that simply did not exist for black men in Alabama. Growing up, Thompson had learned the intricate dance of survival in a segregated society. He learned to step off the sidewalk when white people approached. He learned which water fountains he could drink from and which he could not. He learned to never make direct eye contact with white women, to always address white men as sir, to accept insults and indignities without visible reaction. These were not optional courtesies, but essential survival skills, reinforced by the knowledge that any perceived violation of racial etiquette could result in consequences ranging from lost employment to physical violence to worse. He had learned early that survival meant understanding boundaries, knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, recognizing which spaces were forbidden and which were merely unwelcoming. The Army had been no different. During basic training at Fort Huachuca in Arizona, he and his fellow black recruits had been reminded constantly of their place in the military hierarchy. They could serve their country, yes, but only within carefully defined limits. Their training facilities were separate and generally inferior to those provided for white troops. Their instructors, even the few black officers, emphasized that they were representing their race and that any failure would reflect poorly on all black Americans. The weight of that expectation, the requirement to be constantly better than average just to be considered adequate, was exhausting in ways that white soldiers never had to experience. The journey to England had been Thompson's first time leaving the United States, his first time on an ocean-going vessel, his first experience of being completely separated from the familiar rhythms and restrictions of life in Alabama. The transport ship had been crowded, with soldiers packed into tight quarters that smelled of sweat, diesel fuel, and the perpetual dampness of life at sea. Even on the ship, segregation had been maintained. Black soldiers were assigned to different sleeping areas, ate at different times, had less access to the limited recreational facilities on board. But something had shifted when they reached England. The change had begun the moment their transport ship docked in Liverpool in late June of 1943. British dock workers had treated the arriving American soldiers with friendly curiosity, making no distinction between the black and white troops, as they helped unload equipment and directed soldiers toward their assigned transport. A British foreman had clapped Thompson on the shoulder and welcomed him to England with what seemed like genuine warmth. It was a small gesture, but one that would have been unthinkable from a white man in a position of authority back home. On his second day in London, Thompson had witnessed something that had shaken his understanding of how the world worked. An elderly British woman on a crowded bus had not just allowed him to sit near her, she had actively insisted he take her seat, treating him with a courtesy and respect that would have been unthinkable in Alabama. When Thompson had politely tried to decline, uncomfortable with the reversal of the social order he had always known, she had been genuinely confused by his hesitation. A shopkeeper near his base had served him tea and asked about his family back home with what seemed like genuine interest, sitting down across from him at a small table in the back of the shop and listening to his descriptions of Alabama with the fascinated attention someone might give to stories from an exotic foreign land. The man had seemed genuinely shocked when Thompson mentioned some of the restrictions and segregation laws he had lived under, responding with a mixture of disbelief and distaste that suggested he found such practices fundamentally wrong. Children in the street waved at him with the same enthusiasm they showed all the American soldiers, making no distinction based on the color of his uniform or his skin. They asked him for chewing gum and chocolate, with the same hopeful expressions they showed to white American troops. One small boy, perhaps 6 years old, had asked Thompson if he was a cowboy from Texas, apparently having learned about America primarily from Western films and assuming all American soldiers were cowboys. This evening, Thompson had ventured into central London with 3 other black soldiers from his transportation unit. Private James Washington was from Philadelphia, a city where segregation was less formal but no less real than in the South. Washington was 24 years old, the son of a factory worker and a school teacher, a man who had graduated from high school and hoped to attend college after the conflict ended. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that Thompson admired, a man who seemed to have found a way to maintain his self-respect despite the constant indignities of segregated life. Corporal Robert Jenkins hailed from rural Georgia and carried the quiet wariness of a man who had learned young that any interaction with white people could turn dangerous without warning. At 26, Jenkins was the oldest of the group, married with 2 small children back home. He rarely talked about his family, but Thompson had seen him writing letters home nearly every evening, his large hands carefully forming words on paper in the dim light of their barracks. Jenkins had the kind of deep caution that came from having witnessed violence, from knowing that the wrong word or gesture could have terrible consequences. Private Samuel Mitchell was from Harlem in New York City, the most confident of the group, accustomed to the relative freedom of a large black community in the North. Mitchell was only 20 years old, but carried himself with an assurance that sometimes worried Thompson. Mitchell had grown up in a place where black people owned businesses, where black artists and musicians were celebrated, where you could walk down streets filled with black faces and black voices and feel, for a moment, like you were in a world of your own making. He had less experience with the kind of brutal, explicit racism that Thompson and Jenkins had grown up navigating, and sometimes seemed not to fully appreciate how dangerous it could be. They had heard about the Red Lion from British civilians who worked at their base, who had assured them they would be welcome there. The recommendation had come from a middle-aged British woman named Mrs. Patterson, who supervised the cleaning staff at their barracks. She had overheard them discussing where they might go on their evening off, and had immediately suggested the Red Lion, giving them detailed directions and assuring them that the owner was a good man who would treat them fairly. The pub was a typical London establishment, with dark wood paneling worn smooth by decades of elbows and hands, brass fixtures polished to a warm glow despite years of wear, and the lingering smell of tobacco smoke and spilled beer that seemed to be embedded in the very walls. The ceiling was low, crossed with dark beams, and the floor was uneven in the way of very old buildings that had settled over centuries. Photographs and paintings covered the walls, showing the pub in different eras, the surrounding neighborhood in years past, groups of men in the uniforms of previous conflicts. The pub was crowded with a mix of British civilians, Royal Air Force personnel still in uniform, and American servicemen. Thompson and his companions found a small table near the back, squeezed between a group of British factory workers still in their overalls and a pair of RAF pilots discussing their recent sortie over France in voices hoarse from oxygen masks and high altitudes. The factory workers nodded in friendly acknowledgement as the 4 black soldiers sat down, then returned to their conversation about production quotas and a supervisor they all seemed to dislike. The barmaid who approached their table introduced herself as Margaret. She was perhaps 35 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a practical style, and the kind of sturdy build that came from years of physical work. Her hands showed calluses and small scars, evidence of long hours pulling pints and hauling kegs. Her face had the tired lines of someone who had survived hardship and kept going, but her smile was genuine and her voice was friendly as she took their orders. "First time at the Red Lion, loves?" she asked, pulling a small notepad from her apron pocket. "You're in for a treat, best bitter in London, though I'll admit I'm biased. My father built up this pub from nothing after the previous conflict, and I've been working here since I was tall enough to see over the bar. What can I get you, gentlemen?" Thompson ordered a pint of bitter, still not quite accustomed to the idea that he could simply walk into a pub and expect to be served without incident. Washington asked for the same. Jenkins requested a half pint, explaining that he was not much of a drinker, and Margaret smiled and said that was probably wise, given how strong English beer could be if you were not used to it. Mitchell ordered a pint and asked if they had any crisps, using the British term with the careful pronunciation of someone who had learned it recently and was proud of getting it right. Margaret returned a few minutes later with their drinks and a bowl of crisps, setting them down with a practiced efficiency that came from years of experience. The bitter was darker and more complex than the beer Thompson was used to, with a slightly warm temperature that had surprised him the first time he had tried English beer. The other soldiers had warned him about it, explaining that the British preferred their beer at cellar temperature rather than ice cold, and that it grew on you after a while. "If you lads need anything, just give a shout," Margaret said, wiping down their table with a damp cloth she had tucked into her apron. "And welcome to England. We appreciate you coming all this way to help us out." Thompson thanked her, genuinely touched by the welcome. The 4 soldiers settled into their evening, nursing their beers and talking quietly among themselves. The atmosphere of the pub was warm, despite the summer evening outside, heated by the press of bodies and conversations. The sound was a pleasant murmur of voices, punctuated occasionally by laughter or someone calling out an order to the bar. Washington told a story about a letter he had received from his mother, who was convinced he was starving on British rations and kept sending him packages of food that arrived months late and usually half-spoiled. He described opening the most recent package to find cookies that had turned to powder and a cake that had developed an impressive coating of mold. The British soldiers at the next table overheard and laughed, one of them commenting that British mothers did the exact same thing, convinced that military rations were slowly starving their sons despite all evidence to the contrary. Jenkins described the English countryside near their base, which reminded him oddly of parts of Georgia, despite the complete absence of cotton fields and the presence of ancient stone walls instead of wooden fences. He talked about walking along narrow country lanes on his days off, seeing sheep grazing in fields that had been farmed for centuries, passing stone churches that were older than anything he had ever seen in America. The age of everything had struck him powerfully, the sense that people had been living and working in these same places for hundreds of years, that the stone walls and hedgerows and villages had a permanence that seemed foreign to someone from America, where everything was newer, more temporary. Mitchell was planning to attend a dance at a local church hall the following weekend and was debating whether he would actually have the courage to ask any of the British girls to dance. Washington teased him about it, pointing out that Mitchell had never seemed to lack confidence with women back home in Harlem. Mitchell admitted that this felt different, that he was unsure of the social rules, worried about causing offense or creating an awkward situation. Jenkins offered quiet advice, suggesting that Mitchell should wait and see if any of the British girls seemed interested rather than presuming that it was better to be cautious in unfamiliar social territory. It was a peaceful evening, the kind of simple social gathering that white American soldiers took for granted, but that felt almost miraculous to men who had spent their entire lives being reminded that they were not welcome in most public accommodations. The warmth of the pub, the friendly chatter of British civilians who treated them as just more American servicemen, the simple act of being able to sit and enjoy a drink without constant vigilance about whether they were violating some unspoken boundary, all of this created a sense of relaxation that Thompson had rarely experienced. For a moment, he could almost forget the weight of constant awareness that he carried everywhere in America. The calculation of risk and propriety that was so ingrained, he barely noticed it anymore. The trouble started about 40 minutes later, when a group of 7 white American soldiers from a different unit entered the pub. Their leader was a corporal from Georgia named Robert Henderson, a man whose face seemed to be set in a permanent expression of contempt. Henderson was 26 years old, from a small town outside Savannah, where his father owned a general store that served white customers only. He had grown up in a world where white supremacy was not merely accepted, but celebrated, where the inferiority of black people was treated as scientific fact, where any challenge to racial hierarchy was met with swift and often violent response. Henderson had volunteered for the army in early 1942, motivated less by patriotism than by the opportunity to escape a failing business and a wife he had married too young. The army had given him a rank and authority that he had lacked in civilian life, and he wielded that authority with the particular viciousness of a man who had himself felt powerless for too long. His unit had arrived in England just 3 weeks earlier, and he had been dismayed to discover that British civilians did not seem to understand or respect the proper social order between white and black Americans. Henderson spotted Thompson's table immediately, and his expression darkened with the reflexive anger of a man who saw black people in a space he considered reserved for whites. He said something to his companions that Thompson could not hear over the noise of the pub, but the intent was clear from the way they all turned to stare. Thompson felt his stomach tighten with familiar dread. He had seen that look before, had learned to recognize the particular combination of anger and disgust that some white men displayed when they encountered black people in spaces they considered their own. Henderson approached Thompson's table with the swagger of a man accustomed to having his authority go unchallenged. His boots thudded heavily on the wooden floor, and nearby conversations faltered as people sensed the tension. He leaned down over the table, close enough that Thompson could smell the whiskey on his breath, close enough that Thompson could see the small scar on Henderson's chin and the way his jaw muscles clenched. When Henderson spoke, his Georgia drawl was thick and deliberate, each word carefully pronounced to ensure maximum humiliation. "You boys are in the wrong establishment," Henderson said, his voice loud enough to carry across the surrounding tables, ensuring that his enforcement of racial boundaries would have an audience. "This here is for American soldiers. You need to find somewhere more suitable for your kind. There's probably some place down by the docks where they don't mind serving coloreds. But this is a decent pub for decent soldiers, and you're making the other Americans uncomfortable. So why don't you finish up your drinks and move along before there's any trouble?" The conversations at nearby tables began to die down as people turned to watch. Thompson felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the rapid calculation that had become second nature over 22 years of navigating a world designed to remind him of his subordinate status. His hands, resting on the table, wanted to clench into fists, but he kept them deliberately relaxed. His eyes wanted to meet Henderson's stare, to refuse to be cowed, but he kept them lowered. Every instinct developed over years of survival told him that confrontation would only make things worse. In Alabama, in Arizona, in every American military installation he had ever been stationed at, this moment had a predictable outcome. He and his friends would leave quietly. To do otherwise would mean risking not just violence but formal military punishment. The system was designed to ensure that black soldiers understood that resistance, even to clear injustice, would be met with consequences far more severe than any temporary humiliation. A black soldier who fought back against a white soldier, even in self-defense, even when clearly in the right, would face court-martial. A black soldier who refused to leave a whites-only establishment would face charges of insubordination. The rules were clear and consistently enforced. Thompson started to stand, ready to leave, as he had done countless times before. Corporal Jenkins was already gathering his cap, his face carefully expressionless in the way that black men learned to mask their feelings in dangerous situations. Private Washington's hands were trembling slightly as he reached for his coat, his jaw clenched with suppressed anger at yet another humiliation they were expected to accept without protest. Only Mitchell seemed hesitant, his jaw set in an expression that suggested he was tired of always being the one forced to leave, tired of accepting humiliation as the price of avoiding confrontation. But even Mitchell was starting to rise, recognizing that individual defiance would only make the situation worse for all of them. But then something unexpected happened, something that would change the trajectory of the evening and, in ways large and small, the trajectory of Thompson's life and the lives of thousands of other Black American soldiers serving in Britain. Margaret the barmaid appeared at Henderson's elbow with the swiftness of someone who had spent years managing drunk and difficult customers. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, and standing next to Henderson, she looked almost child-sized. But there was nothing uncertain in her posture or her voice as she confronted him. She had the kind of sturdy build that came from years of physical work, from hauling kegs and moving furniture, and standing on her feet for 12-hour shifts. Her voice, when she spoke, was polite but firm, carrying the authority of someone operating in their own domain. "Excuse me, love, but these gentlemen were here first and they've paid for their drinks," she said, her tone suggesting that she was pointing out an obvious fact that Henderson had somehow missed. "They're welcome here, same as anyone else. We don't turn away paying customers who are behaving themselves. House policy, established by my father and maintained by me. Every serviceman is welcome, regardless of which unit they're from or where they're from or anything else." Henderson turned to her with an expression of disbelief that someone of her status would dare to contradict him. In his worldview, the social hierarchy was clear and immutable. He was a white American soldier, a non-commissioned officer, a representative of the great nation that was coming to save Britain from defeat. She was merely a barmaid, a woman, and a British one at that. The idea that she would presume to tell him what to do, to defend black soldiers against his legitimate exercise of authority, seemed to genuinely confuse him. For a moment, he simply stared at her, as if waiting for her to realize her mistake and apologize. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand the situation here," Henderson said when she did not back down, speaking slowly and clearly, as if explaining something to a child or to someone whose intelligence he doubted. "You don't understand how things work with us Americans. We have different standards back home. We keep our colored boys separate from white soldiers. It's not personal against them. It's just the way things are. It's better for everyone, keeps things peaceful and orderly. We'd appreciate it if you'd cooperate with that while we're here helping you folks out. Nobody wants any trouble. So if you could just ask these boys to move along, we can all get back to having a pleasant evening." What happened next would be recounted in letters home, discussed in Parliament, and reported in newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic. Margaret did not back down. Instead, she straightened to her full height, which still left her considerably shorter than Henderson, and raised her voice enough that everyone in the pub could hear her clearly. Her eyes, which had been friendly when serving Thompson earlier, now held a steely determination that suggested she had reached the limit of her tolerance. "I understand perfectly well, thank you very much," she said, her voice sharp with an anger that had been building for months as she watched American soldiers try to import their prejudices into her establishment. "And in this pub, the only standard is that paying customers who behave with decency are treated with respect. These men have done nothing wrong. They've been sitting here quietly, bothering no one, drinking their beer and minding their own business. They were here before you arrived. They've paid for their drinks and they have every right to be here. You're the one causing trouble. You're the one disturbing other customers. These men are welcome here. If you have a problem with that, you're the one who needs to leave. This is my pub and those are my rules. Take them or leave them." The pub had gone almost completely silent now, dozens of conversations halting as people turned to watch the confrontation. The air seemed to thicken with tension. Thompson remained frozen in his half-standing position, unsure what to do, unable to process what he was witnessing. A white woman, a stranger, was defending him against a white soldier. It contradicted everything he understood about how the world worked. A British Army sergeant at a nearby table stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor in the sudden quiet. He was a broad-shouldered man with the weathered face of someone who had seen extensive combat, probably in his early 30s. His uniform bore the Africa Star ribbon, indicating service in North Africa. and his hands had the scarred, weathered look of a man who had spent years handling weapons and equipment. His voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the sudden silence, with the kind of authority that came from genuine combat experience rather than mere rank. "The lady's right," he said, looking directly at Henderson with an expression that suggested he had dealt with difficult soldiers before and was not particularly impressed or intimidated. "These American lads have done nothing wrong. They're having a quiet drink, bothering no one. You're the one disturbing the peace of this establishment. I suggest you either sit down and order a drink like a civilized person, or leave and let the rest of us enjoy our evening." A Royal Air Force flight lieutenant joined him, rising from his table with the slightly stiff movement of someone who had been injured and not quite fully recovered. He was young, probably not yet 25, but his eyes had the particular weariness that came from flying combat missions night after night, knowing that each sortie might be your last. His uniform was slightly rumpled, and he had the pale, drawn look of someone who was not getting enough sleep, which was common among bomber crews who flew night missions over Germany. "Quite right," the pilot said in the crisp accent of the British upper class, the kind of accent that suggested private schools and old family money. "I've just spent 6 hours over Germany being shot at by people who believe in racial superiority and all that rot. I'm not going to come back to my own country and watch someone discriminate against a fellow serviceman in a British pub. It's the very thing we're fighting against, isn't it? The whole point is that people shouldn't be judged by their race or religion or anything else except their character and actions." Henderson looked around, clearly expecting support from the other white American soldiers in the pub. But the American servicemen who were seated with British companions looked uncomfortable. Some stared into their drinks, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Others shifted in their seats, visibly uneasy. The presence of British civilians and British military personnel seemed to create a social pressure that made it difficult for them to openly support segregation, even if they privately agreed with it. To do so would mean publicly aligning themselves with the kind of racial ideology that Britain was supposedly fighting against, and that was a position few were willing to take in front of their British hosts. An elderly British man at the bar, who wore the ribbons of the previous conflict on his worn jacket, spoke up in a voice rough with age and cigarette smoke. His hands trembled slightly with what might have been age, or might have been the lingering effects of gas exposure from the trenches. But his voice was steady and firm. He looked to be in his 60s with white hair and a deeply lined face that spoke of hardship and survival. "My son is fighting in North Africa right now," he said, his voice carrying across the silent pub. "Fighting with the 8th Army against Rommel. My daughter is working in a munitions factory 12 hours a day, making shells and bullets, coming home so tired she can barely eat before she falls asleep. My wife was lost in the Blitz 2 years ago when our house took a direct hit. I dug her out of the rubble with my own hands, but she was already gone. So far as I'm concerned, any man in uniform fighting against tyranny is welcome at my table, and I don't give a damn what color he is. My son is out there risking his life alongside men from all over the empire. Indians, Africans, West Indians, all fighting together. We're fighting people who think some races are superior to others. I'll be damned if I'm going to support that sort of thinking in my own local." The pub owner emerged from behind the bar, wiping his hands on his apron with deliberate slowness. He was a large man, probably in his late 50s, with thick arms and a broad chest that suggested years of physical labor, hauling barrels and kegs. He had the kind of presence that suggested he had settled many disputes in his establishment over the years, that he knew how to handle difficult customers and was not easily intimidated. His face was stern, but not unkind, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man speaking in his own business, on his own property. "Gentlemen, this is my establishment," he said, looking directly at Henderson and his companions, then letting his gaze sweep across the entire pub to make sure everyone understood his position. "I've been running this pub for 32 years. My father ran it before me, and his father before him. This pub has been in my family since 1879. In all that time, we've had one simple rule. Every man in uniform is welcome here, whether he's British, American, Canadian, French, Polish, or from anywhere else. The color of his skin doesn't enter into it. We've served men from every corner of the empire, every color under the sun. And I've never had cause to regret it." He paused, letting his words sink in, then continued with even greater emphasis. "Now, these lads here," he gestured to Thompson and his friends, "have been nothing but polite since they arrived. They've paid for their drinks, they've bothered no one, and they're welcome to stay as long as they like. You, on the other hand, are causing a disturbance in my establishment. So I'll give you a choice. You can sit down, order a drink, and behave in a civilized manner, treating all the customers in this pub with the respect they deserve. Or you can leave, right now. Those are your options. You've got 10 seconds to decide, and then I'll have you thrown out if necessary." Henderson's face flushed red, the color starting at his collar and spreading upward until his entire face was the color of a ripe tomato. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and the muscles in his jaw worked as he ground his teeth together. For a moment, Thompson thought Henderson might actually throw a punch, which would have been a disaster for everyone involved. Violence in a pub could lead to military police being called, to formal complaints, to all sorts of complications that would make life difficult for everyone. But one of Henderson's companions, a private who seemed younger and less certain than the others, put a hand on Henderson's arm. He was a thin young man with sandy hair and the kind of soft features that suggested he had not been in the army very long. "Come on, Corp," the private said quietly, his voice uncertain but insistent. "This ain't worth it. Let's just go somewhere else. There's plenty of other pubs. No sense making a big scene over this. It's not our country, not our rules." For a long moment, Henderson stood frozen, his authority challenged in a way that clearly had never happened to him before. The entire pub watched in silence as he struggled with the realization that his assumptions about how the world worked, assumptions that had never been questioned in his hometown in Georgia, did not apply here. He had expected British civilians to defer to American preferences, to accept American social customs out of gratitude for American help. Instead, he was being told that his prejudices were unwelcome, that they contradicted the very principles Britain claimed to be fighting for. Finally, without another word, he turned sharply and walked toward the door, his boots hitting the floor hard enough to make the glassware behind the bar rattle. His companions followed, though a few looked back with expressions that might have been embarrassment or perhaps something close to shame. One of them, the young private who had urged Henderson to leave, caught Thompson's eye for a moment and seemed to mouth an apology before following the others out into the night. The pub owner turned to Thompson's table, his expression softening immediately now that the confrontation was over. "Sorry about that unpleasantness, lads. That's not the kind of behavior we tolerate here. You're welcome in this establishment any time, and don't let anyone tell you different. First round is on the house, and I apologize that you had to deal with that nonsense in my pub. No one should be treated that way, especially not in their off-duty time when they're just trying to relax." As conversations gradually resumed, Thompson sat back down in a kind of daze. His legs felt weak, and his hands were trembling slightly with the after-effects of adrenaline. In his 22 years, he had never witnessed white people, strangers no less, standing up on behalf of black people being mistreated. The experience was so far outside his understanding of how the world worked that he struggled to process it. He had grown up being told, both explicitly and implicitly, that white people would always side with other white people against black people, that racial solidarity among whites was absolute and unbreakable. It was one of the fundamental facts that shaped every interaction, every decision, every moment of a black person's life in America. But here were white British people, civilians and military personnel, publicly defending black American soldiers against white American soldiers. They had risked creating an international incident, had potentially offended men from the nation that was helping defend their country, had chosen to support strangers of a different race against members of their own race from their own allied nation. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Everything Thompson thought he understood about race relations, about the universal nature of white supremacy, about the inevitability of discrimination, was being challenged by this single incident. Margaret returned with fresh pints for their table, setting them down with a gentle smile that suggested the confrontation had not upset her particularly. She seemed, if anything, energized by it, as if standing up for what she believed was right had given her a sense of satisfaction. "Don't worry about him, lover," she said, patting Thompson's shoulder in a maternal gesture that made his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. We get all sorts in here, but we don't tolerate that kind of behavior. Never have, never will. My husband was Tom Peterson. Lost him at Dunkirk 3 years ago. He died fighting against people who believed some humans were superior to others based on where they were born, or what they looked like, or what religion they practiced. He died fighting against that kind of hatred. I'll be damned if I'm going to stand in my own pub, in the country Tom died for, and watch someone be mistreated for the color of their skin. That's exactly what we're fighting against. That's why good men like my Tom are gone. So you're welcome here any time, and don't let anyone tell you different. Thompson found his voice with difficulty, his throat tight with emotion. Thank you, Mum. We appreciate it more than you know. More than we can really say. Margaret smiled, and for a moment her eyes were bright with unshed tears. No need for thanks, love. It's just common decency. It's just doing what's right. Now drink up before it gets warm. English bitter is best when it's fresh. What Thompson did not know, could not have known, was that he had just witnessed a moment in what would become a significant source of tension between American and British populations throughout the conflict. The incident at the Red Lion was far from isolated. Across England, similar confrontations were occurring with increasing frequency as white American soldiers attempted to enforce segregation practices in British establishments, only to find that British civilians simply refused to cooperate. The conflict had roots in fundamentally different social systems and historical experiences. Britain in 1943 had its own complex class divisions and was far from a perfect society. The British Empire had built enormous wealth through colonialism and exploitation of people in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Racial prejudice certainly existed in British society, and many British people held views that would be considered racist by modern standards. The history of empire had created a sense of British superiority over colonial subjects that shaped attitudes and policies. But Britain did not have the systematic, legally enforced racial segregation that characterized American life, particularly in the southern states. The relatively small black British population, numbering perhaps 15,000 people concentrated mainly in port cities like Liverpool, Cardiff, and London, faced discrimination and prejudice in employment, housing, and social life. But they were not legally barred from using the same public facilities as white people. There were no laws dictating where black people could sit on buses, which water fountains they could use, which schools they could attend, who they could marry. The discrimination was real but less formal, less comprehensive, less total than the system that governed every aspect of life for black Americans. When British civilians encountered black American soldiers, most saw them simply as American servicemen who had come thousands of miles to help in the conflict against Germany and its allies. The British public had been subjected to years of propaganda emphasizing that the conflict was being fought against a regime built explicitly on theories of racial superiority and the belief that some humans were inherently inferior to others based on their race or religion. The propaganda had emphasized that Britain was fighting for freedom, for democracy, for the principle that all people deserve to be treated with dignity regardless of their background. To then adopt racial segregation for Allied troops seemed to many British civilians like a fundamental contradiction of the very principles they were supposedly fighting for. How could Britain claim to be fighting against racial ideology while simultaneously enforcing racial discrimination against its own allies? The contradiction was particularly stark for people who had lost family members in the conflict, who were making tremendous sacrifices in the name of defeating tyranny and hatred. American military authorities, however, expected British communities to accommodate and enforce American segregation practices. This expectation was based on several assumptions, all of which would prove problematic. First, American commanders assumed that racial segregation was a natural and normal practice that any civilized society would recognize as appropriate and necessary. They believed that separating the races prevented conflict and maintained order, and that this was simply common sense that everyone should understand. Second, they believed that British gratitude for American assistance in the conflict would translate into British willingness to defer to American social customs. After all, America was sending hundreds of thousands of troops, vast amounts of equipment, and billions of dollars in aid to help save Britain from defeat. Surely that earned America the right to have its social preferences respected. Third, they fundamentally underestimated how seriously many British civilians took the propaganda about fighting for freedom and equality against a racist regime. In September of 1942, the United States Army had distributed a pamphlet to British civilians titled Instructions for American Servicemen in Britain. The pamphlet was ostensibly designed to help prevent cultural misunderstandings between American troops and British civilians. It covered topics like British currency, food rationing, social customs, and common phrases that had different meanings in British and American English. While the pamphlet advised Americans to respect British customs and warned them that British people might seem reserved or formal compared to Americans, American commanders simultaneously worked behind the scenes to encourage British establishments to adopt segregation policies for American servicemen. The War Office in London received numerous requests from American military authorities asking that certain pubs, dance halls, and recreational facilities be designated for white soldiers only, with separate establishments set aside for black troops. The Americans argued that this was necessary to prevent conflict between white and black American soldiers, that it reflected normal American practices, and that failing to maintain segregation would create disciplinary problems. Some American officers even suggested that British civilians should be educated about the supposed necessity of racial separation, that they needed to understand the differences between races and why integration was problematic. These requests were almost universally rejected. The British government's position, while not driven by any particular commitment to racial equality as a moral principle, was pragmatic and also influenced by concerns about maintaining the moral high ground in the conflict. Britain was fighting a conflict against a regime built explicitly on theories of racial superiority. To adopt formal segregation policies for Allied troops would undermine the moral framework Britain was using to justify the enormous sacrifices the conflict demanded of its civilian population. How could Britain claim to be fighting for freedom and equality while simultaneously implementing racial discrimination in its own pubs and dance halls? How could Britain criticize German racial policies while enforcing American racial policies? Additionally, there were practical concerns. Britain was relying heavily on troops and resources from its colonies and dominions, including significant numbers of soldiers from India, Africa, the Caribbean, and other parts of the empire. These colonial troops were already experiencing their own forms of discrimination within the British military system, but they were not subject to the kind of formal, comprehensive segregation that characterized American practices. If Britain began enforcing segregation for American troops, it would raise uncomfortable questions about why colonial soldiers were being treated differently, potentially undermining the imperial system and creating resentment among troops Britain desperately needed. But the British government's official position and the attitudes of ordinary British civilians were sometimes two different things. The reality was more complex and varied across different communities and social contexts. In some areas, particularly those near American bases that housed predominantly white units with commanders who aggressively pushed for segregation, local establishments did informally adopt segregation practices. Sometimes this was due to genuine racial prejudice among the British establishment owners themselves, who saw black people as inferior and were happy to exclude them. Sometimes it was due to economic pressure, the fear that refusing to cooperate with American demands would result in the establishment being placed off limits to all American troops, resulting in lost business at a time when money was tight. Sometimes it was simply a desire to avoid confrontations and trouble, a willingness to go along with American preferences to keep things peaceful and profitable. In other communities, particularly in cities like London, that had longer histories of diversity and more contact with people from various parts of the British Empire, the reaction was more like what Thompson had experienced at the Red Lion. British civilians, while not necessarily holding progressive views on race by modern standards, found the American segregation system strange, troubling, and fundamentally at odds with the ideals they believed they were fighting for. Many had personal reasons for opposing discrimination, having lost family members in the conflict and wanting to believe those deaths had meaning, that they were fighting for something important and noble. The Red Lion incident might have remained a minor occurrence, one of thousands of small confrontations happening across England, except that Margaret the barmaid had a cousin who worked as a secretary for a member of Parliament. When Margaret recounted the incident during a family dinner 3 days later, describing how she had stood up to an American soldier who tried to throw out black servicemen from her pub, her cousin Emma was fascinated. Emma had been hearing similar stories from friends and neighbours, accounts of American soldiers trying to enforce segregation in British establishments, and British civilians resisting these efforts. She had begun to wonder if there was a larger pattern, if these individual incidents were part of a broader conflict between American racial practices and British social norms. Emma mentioned the incident to her employer, a Labour MP named David Morrison, who represented a working-class constituency in East London. Morrison had been increasingly concerned about reports of American military segregation being imposed on British soil. He had received letters from constituents describing confrontations at local pubs and dance halls. He had heard from church leaders who had invited both black and white American soldiers to social events, only to have American officers demand that the events be segregated or threaten to order their men not to attend. A dance hall owner in his constituency had contacted him about being pressured to implement separate nights for black and white American soldiers, which the owner found morally wrong but was afraid to resist for fear of losing all American business. The more Morrison looked into the issue, the more troubled he became. He saw it as a matter of principle that went to the heart of what Britain was fighting for. If Britain was going to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of lives in a conflict against racial ideology, if it was going to demand that its civilian population endure years of hardship and danger in the name of defeating tyranny, then Britain needed to actually stand for something. Allowing American racial segregation to be imposed on British soil contradicted everything the British government was telling its people about the meaning and purpose of the conflict. Morrison raised the question during a parliamentary session in late July of 1943, asking whether the British government was aware that American military authorities were pressuring British establishments to adopt racial segregation policies, and whether the government had any position on this practice. The question sparked a heated debate that was covered extensively in British newspapers. Conservative MPs generally argued that Britain should defer to American social customs out of gratitude for American assistance and to avoid creating diplomatic tensions that could harm the alliance. They suggested that Americans understood their own social dynamics better than British people did, and that it was not Britain's place to interfere with how American military authorities chose to organize their troops. Labour MPs and some Liberal MPs countered that Britain was fighting a conflict against racial superiority theories and that adopting segregation would betray fundamental principles. They argued that British sovereignty meant Britain got to decide what social practices would be tolerated on British soil, and that American aid did not give America the right to impose its discriminatory customs on British establishments. Some MPs pointed out the hypocrisy of fighting against German racial ideology while simultaneously enforcing American racial practices. The debate was passionate and sometimes heated, touching on fundamental questions about national sovereignty, alliance obligations, racial justice, and the meaning of the conflict. It revealed deep divisions in British society about race, empire, and Britain's relationship with America. The fact that it was happening in Parliament, being reported in newspapers and discussed in pubs and living rooms across the country, meant that issues of racial segregation and discrimination were becoming part of the British public consciousness in new ways. The Daily Mirror, a popular tabloid newspaper with a large working-class readership, ran a major story titled "Democracy's Colour Line" that detailed multiple incidents of white American soldiers attempting to enforce segregation in British pubs and dance halls, and British civilians resisting these efforts. The story was written by a young reporter named Sarah Collins, who had been following the issue for months after hearing about incidents from her own family members. She had interviewed dozens of pub owners, dance hall operators, and British civilians about their experiences with American segregation practices. The story included an interview with Margaret, who had become something of a folk hero in her neighborhood after word spread about how she had stood up to the American soldiers. Margaret had initially been reluctant to talk to the press, uncomfortable with the attention, but Collins had convinced her that her story needed to be told, that it represented something important about British values and resistance to injustice. "I lost my husband at Dunkirk," Margaret told the reporter, her voice steady but her eyes bright with unshed tears even 3 years after Tom's death. "He died fighting against tyranny and hatred. He died fighting against people who believed some humans were superior to others based on their blood, or their background, or their religion. He believed that every person had worth and dignity, that we were all fighting for a world where people would be judged by their character and actions, rather than by things they couldn't control like the color of their skin or where they were born. I'll be damned if I'm going to stand in my own pub, in the country Tom died for, and watch someone be mistreated because of the color of his skin. That's not what we're fighting for. That's exactly what we're fighting against." The article resonated powerfully with British readers, many of whom had similar feelings about the meaning and purpose of the conflict. The newspaper's letters section was flooded with responses over the following weeks. A barmaid in Liverpool wrote, describing how she had refused to serve white American soldiers who demanded that black American servicemen be removed from her establishment, and how the white soldiers had complained to their officers, who had tried to have her pub placed off limits to all American troops. A dance hall owner in Manchester recounted being threatened by American military police when he refused to bar black soldiers from attending dances, and how he had stood his ground even when it meant losing significant business. A vicar in a small village in Kent wrote about inviting both black and white American soldiers to a church social, wanting to show Christian hospitality to all the young men far from home. American officers had demanded that the event be segregated, or they would order their white soldiers not to attend. The vicar had refused, and the event had proceeded with mixed attendance, which he described as a lovely evening that showed how people of different backgrounds could enjoy fellowship together when given the opportunity. A British Army officer who had served in North Africa wrote about fighting alongside troops from across the empire, men of every race and religion, and how the experience had shown him that courage and character had nothing to do with skin color. He expressed anger that American segregation practices seemed designed to contradict the very principles the Allies were supposedly fighting for. The letters kept coming, week after week, creating a sustained public conversation about race, discrimination, and the meaning of the conflict. British newspapers began running more stories about American segregation, contrasting it with British values and questioning whether Britain should tolerate such practices on British soil. The issue became a topic of conversation in pubs, in churches, in factories, in homes across the country. The American military leadership in England found itself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. General Dwight Eisenhower, commanding American forces in the European theater, was receiving complaints from multiple directions. White American soldiers, particularly those from southern states, complained that British civilians were not respecting American social customs and were encouraging black soldiers to forget their place. They reported that black soldiers who had spent time around British civilians were becoming more assertive, less willing to accept discrimination without question, more likely to file complaints about mistreatment. At the same time, British authorities were dealing with the social tensions these conflicts created. The British government was fielding complaints from constituents about American attempts to impose segregation. Local authorities were dealing with confrontations in pubs and dance halls. The Metropolitan Police in London reported an increase in incidents involving American servicemen of both races, often triggered by attempts to enforce or resist segregation in public places. Eisenhower personally opposed segregation. He believed it was unjust and recognized that it undermined American credibility in claiming to fight for freedom and democracy. But he was also a military officer who understood that challenging deeply embedded institutional racism would create enormous political problems. Congress was controlled by a coalition that included powerful Southern Democrats who would view any attempt to desegregate the military as an attack on their entire social system. Public opinion in America was deeply divided on racial issues, and any attempt to force integration would create a political firestorm that could threaten the entire war effort. The solution Eisenhower and his staff developed was characteristically pragmatic and ultimately unsatisfying. Rather than attempting to enforce segregation in British establishments, which was creating diplomatic problems and making America look hypocritical, they would create more recreational facilities on American bases themselves. They would build or expand base clubs, theaters, and sports facilities, giving soldiers more entertainment options without needing to frequent British pubs and dance halls. This approach avoided direct confrontation with British sensibilities while maintaining segregation within the American military itself, where it could be enforced without British interference. It was, like many compromises, a solution that failed to address the fundamental injustice while attempting to manage its most visible symptoms. It reduced some of the friction between American and British populations by limiting contact, but it did nothing to change the discriminatory system itself. It was designed to make segregation less visible rather than to eliminate it, to avoid controversy rather than to pursue justice. But the policy change did nothing to address the confrontations that continued to occur whenever American soldiers, both black and white, ventured into British communities, and increasingly British civilians were making their positions clear, creating an environment where black American soldiers experienced something they had never known before. White people treating them as equals, defending them against discrimination, welcoming them into spaces without restriction or suspicion. In October of 1943, white American soldiers in the town of Bamber Bridge in Lancashire attempted to enforce segregation at a local pub that had become popular with black soldiers from a nearby transportation unit. The pub's landlord refused to bar the black soldiers, arguing that all American servicemen were welcome in his establishment and that he saw no reason to exclude some based on their race. White American military police arrived to arrest a black soldier who was allegedly drunk and disorderly, though witnesses later disputed whether the soldier was actually intoxicated or whether the arrest was pretextual, designed to intimidate black soldiers into avoiding the pub. The situation escalated rapidly when British civilians and even some British soldiers intervened on behalf of the black American soldiers, arguing that the arrest was unjust and that the soldier had done nothing wrong. More American military police arrived, along with white American soldiers from nearby units. Black American soldiers, feeling that one of their own was being targeted unfairly and emboldened by British support, refused to disperse. The confrontation deteriorated into what became known as the Battle of Bamber Bridge, a riot that lasted several hours and resulted in the death of one black American soldier and injuries to several others, both black and white. Significantly, British civilians had sheltered black American soldiers during the riot, hiding them in homes and shops, providing them with civilian clothes to help them evade American military police. When British police attempted to restore order, they found themselves trying to mediate between American military authorities, who wanted to arrest black soldiers, and British civilians who insisted the black soldiers had been provoked and were defending themselves against unjust treatment. The incident at Bamber Bridge was extreme and violent in ways that most confrontations over segregation were not. But the underlying dynamic that had begun at places like the Red Lion pub was playing out in countless smaller ways across England. British civilians were, often without fully understanding the long-term implications, providing black American soldiers with their first sustained experience of being treated as equals by white people. The psychological impact of this experience was profound and would have consequences that extended far beyond the conflict itself. Private Lloyd Thompson began spending more time in London during his off-duty hours, drawn back to places like the Red Lion where he felt genuinely welcome. He discovered that British civilians would sit and talk with him about topics beyond the war, would ask his opinions on politics and culture and everyday life, would treat him as a person with thoughts and ideas worth hearing, rather than as a representative of a category. British women danced with him at public dances, without the scandalized reactions such behavior would have provoked in Alabama. Children asked him questions about America with innocent curiosity, seeing him as an exotic visitor from a fascinating foreign country, rather than as someone whose presence was threatening or inappropriate. Elderly people thanked him for his service with what seemed like genuine gratitude, treating his contribution to the war effort as valuable and important regardless of his race. Shop clerks served him without hesitation or reluctance. Bus conductors treated him like any other passenger. The cumulative effect of these small interactions, these moments of ordinary human decency, was transformative for someone who had spent his entire life being reminded at every turn that he was considered inferior, unwelcome, suspect. Thompson began writing longer letters to his mother in Birmingham, describing a world that must have seemed almost fantastical to a woman who had spent her entire life navigating the rigid racial hierarchies of the American South. In one letter, preserved in the collection of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, Thompson wrote about having dinner at the home of a British family whose son was serving in the Royal Navy somewhere in the Pacific. "Mama," he wrote in his careful formal handwriting, "they set a place for me at their table just like I was family. Not in the kitchen, not standing up, but at their dining room table with the good dishes. The father asked what I thought about the progress of the campaign in Italy, wanted to know my opinion like it mattered what a colored private thought about military strategy. The mother wanted to know if the food was anything like home, and when I said it was different but good, she asked me to describe what kind of food you make, and she wrote it down like she might try to make it herself. Their little girl, maybe 8 years old, showed me her drawings and asked me to tell her about America. She wanted to know if we really had cowboys and Indians, if everyone owned automobiles, if the buildings were as tall as she had seen in pictures," he continued. "They did not treat me like I was something strange or unwelcome. They did not act like they were doing me a favor or being especially kind. They treated me like I was a guest they were honored to have in their home, like I was a young man far from his family who might appreciate a home-cooked meal and some friendly conversation. After dinner, the father showed me photographs of his son in his Navy uniform, talked about how proud he was but how worried, how he prayed every night for his son's safe return. He showed me those photographs, Mama, like he trusted me with something precious, like he thought I would understand a father's love and fear for his son." The letter concluded, "I did not know that white people could be like this. I did not know this was possible. All my life I was told that white folks would always see us as inferior, that we had to accept our place because that was just how things were and would always be. But these people do not see me that way. They see me as a man, as a soldier, as someone whose thoughts and feelings matter. And if they can see me that way, if it is possible here, then maybe it can be possible back home too. Maybe the way things are is not the way things have to be." This experience was being replicated across England by tens of thousands of black American soldiers, each having their own encounters with British civilians who treated them with a basic human dignity that they had rarely, if ever, experienced from white people before. For many, it was transformative. They were experiencing, for the first time in their lives, something approaching social equality with white people. And crucially, they were experiencing it while wearing the uniform of the United States Army, which meant they could not easily dismiss it as charity or condescension or some peculiar exception. They were being treated as equals because they were serving soldiers, representatives of a nation that claimed to stand for democracy and freedom. The contradiction between the ideals America proclaimed and the reality of how it treated its black citizens had always been apparent to black Americans. The gap between the rhetoric of freedom and equality and the reality of segregation and discrimination was something every black American understood from an early age, but distance and isolation had made it easier for the system to perpetuate itself. When the only white people you encountered were ones who believed in their own superiority, when every institution reinforced the same message about racial hierarchy, when questioning the system could result in violence or worse, it became easier perhaps to internalize doubt, to wonder if perhaps the system reflected some fundamental truth about human nature and racial difference. But when black American soldiers encountered white British civilians who treated them as equals, who seemed genuinely baffled by American segregation practices, who intervened when they witnessed discrimination, it shattered that isolation. It demonstrated that segregation was not a universal or natural state of affairs, but rather a specific system created and maintained by specific choices. It showed that white people and black people could interact as equals when the formal and informal structures enforcing hierarchy were absent. It provided black American soldiers with a glimpse of possibilities that would make the return to American segregation after the conflict, increasingly intolerable. The American military leadership watched these developments with growing concern. Reports from unit commanders noted changes in attitude and behavior among black troops who had spent time in British communities. Some used the word uppity in their reports, revealing more about their own attitudes than about any actual changes in soldier behavior. What they were actually observing was that black soldiers, who had experienced even limited social equality, were less willing to accept discrimination without question, were more likely to file complaints about mistreatment, were more confident in asserting their rights, were less deferential to white authority. This was precisely the outcome that segregationists had always feared. The entire system of segregation relied on the belief, carefully cultivated through law and custom and violence, that the existing social hierarchy reflected natural and inevitable differences between races. The system required black Americans to internalize the idea that their subordinate status was somehow appropriate or at least unchangeable. When black Americans had sustained contact with whites who did not share this belief, who treated them as equals and seemed to find racial hierarchy strange or wrong, the entire ideological foundation of segregation became harder to maintain. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.